Today I will be running you through some of the considerations and procedures within the pediatric field and relevant for SMEs. In this presentation, I will be covering the following points: basic concepts such as what is a PAP and what is a waiver, the timelines and interactions with EMA, where you can find relevant information and guidance in order to prepare a PAP. Also, what is the basic structure of a PAP, two types of procedures, which are modifications and compliance checks, which I think they are relevant. Finally, the incentives and some take-home messages together with some achievements of the Paediatric Regulation. So as you may be aware, the pediatric legislation came into force at the end of 2006, establishing the Committee for Pediatric Medicines, the requirement to submit pediatric investigation plans, and also establishing procedures and incentives. Another important document to read is the European Commission guideline on the format and content of applications for agreement or modification of PAPs and requests for waivers, which contains really detailed information on the format and content of applications for PAPs and waivers, which I think is really useful to read. So what are the objectives of the pediatric regulation? The main objective is to improve the health of children by increasing high quality and ethical research into medicines for children, increasing the availability of authorized medicines, and also increasing the information on these medicines. The aim is to achieve the above without conducting unnecessary studies in children and also without delaying the authorization of medicinal products for adults. As I mentioned before, the Paediatric Regulation establishes the requirement to submit pediatric investigation plans, also known as PIPs. A PIP is basically the basis for development and authorization of a medicinal product for all pediatric population subsets. A PIP includes details of the timing and the studies proposed in order to demonstrate quality, safety, and efficacy in order to fulfill the marketing authorization criteria. A PIP should be agreed upon or amended, as we will see later, by the Pediatric Committee, and also is binding on the company, which means that before marketing authorization application, for instance, a compliance check will need to be done. Another important concept introduced by the pediatric legislation are waivers. Waivers are an exemption to produce results from measures or studies in one or more pediatric subsets for a given condition. It's important to highlight that a waiver is not a prohibition to perform studies. It's only an exemption, so the companies are still free to run those studies. However, to qualify for a reward, the applicant needs to have completed some studies. So when a waiver has been granted, it's not possible to claim for a reward. There are two types of waivers. One is a product-specific waiver, which the name is self-explanatory, and there are also class waivers. A class waiver applies to all products aimed at a particular condition. Examples of class waivers are, for instance, products aimed at treating Alzheimer's disease or at treating breast carcinoma. These would be products that could be granted class waivers. Let's have a look now at when it's necessary to submit a PAP or a waiver application. On the left-hand side, you see that a PAP is needed for unauthorized products when requesting a marketing authorization as per Article 7, and also for already authorized products under Article 8 when seeking new indications, new routes of administrations, or new formulations, although not for new strengths. On the right-hand side, you see when it's not needed to submit a PAP or waiver. This is the case for off-patent products already authorized in the EU, for new medicinal products following in the following categories, such as herbal medicinal products, homeopathic products, generics, hybrid products, and biosimilars. And also, of course, if you have a class waiver for a specific condition, you don't require a PAP or product-specific waiver. In relation to class waivers, I would like to point out that the PDCO reviewed the list of class waivers in 2015. This is important because it revoked 8 class waivers, updated 15 class waivers, and confirmed 9 other class waivers. This new list will come into force after a transition phase of 3 years that will reach its end on the 27th of July of 2018. So it's important to keep in mind this date. From then on, companies will need either a PAP or a product-specific waiver for medicines for all those conditions that will be not covered for class waivers included in the previous list. Aside from PAPs and waivers, it's worth mentioning a new type of authorization introduced by the Paediatric Legislation, which is the Pediatric Use Marketing Authorization, also known as PUMA. This is a new dedicated type of marketing authorization application for exclusive pediatric use. It's for products that are already authorized and that are not covered by patents any longer, so off-patent products. I would like to mention also that as opposed to PAPs, it is not necessary to target the whole pediatric population, but it's also possible only to target an age group with the highest unmet need, for instance. So it can be only limited. Regarding the incentives for PUMA, the incentive is a 10-year marketing protection, if compliance with an agreed PAP is proved, and on the data contained in the PUMA. And also, another incentive is a fee reduction for marketing authorization through the centralized procedure and post-authorization activities for a year. Now let's look at timelines. Here you have a standard development timeline where you see all the different phases of a study till marketing authorization and approval. So when should we submit a PAP? As you see in the purple arrow, a PAP or a waiver application should be submitted no later than upon completion of PK studies in adults, so at the end of phase 1 or initiation of phase 2. This is really important to respect these timelines in order to integrate pediatric into adult development. For example, in case adult trials need to be designed to support pediatric development or to plan formulation development well ahead. After submission of the PAP, we see that during the phase 2 and phase 3, it is possible to submit requests for PAP amendments. Can be submitted as many times as necessary, and this allows the company to modify the PAP according to the development of the product. And also before marketing authorization application, as we can see here, it is required to perform a compliance check on the measures contained in the PAP. All these measures, all these procedures, such as PAP, PAP modifications, and compliance checks are assessed by the Pediatric Committee, the PDCO. Just to emphasize that it's important to know that taking into account that agreeing a PAP takes on average between 8 and 12 months, pediatric PAPs needs to be discussed early on, long before marketing authorization is requested, and also before studies in children are started. As previously explained by my colleagues from Scientific Advice, scientific advice can be requested during the development of the product at different points in times. Applicants may wish to seek scientific advice before or after submitting a PAP, but we recommend to do it as early as possible in the development for the best outcome. Also, scientific questions on the PAP and waivers are outside the scope of the Scientific Advice Working Party. However, any scientific questions relating to the pediatric development can also be discussed by the Scientific Advice Working Party, so you are welcome to submit them, because the Scientific Advice Working Party and the PDCO work together on those questions. Now I'd like to take you through some of the sources of information and guidance that you can find to prepare a PAP. Here you have some of them. The first one, of course, would be the Paediatric Regulation, the legal text. Also, the European Commission guideline on format and content of PAP applications, which I already mentioned in my first slide. the EMA procedural advice in the form of a Q&A, which is available on the website, which I will explain a bit later, and also other documents and guidelines available on the website. As part of the guidance available, you can find, for instance, previous PIP decisions that can be searched by condition, for instance. We find that this can be very useful for applicants to see what an opinion looks like, and also what are the type of studies that have been agreed with the PDCO for different therapeutic areas. Also, there are pediatric guidelines available on specific fields, such as on quality, non-clinical, clinical safety and efficacy, among many other fields. And also the necessary templates, forms, submission dates as well that you may need during the submission of a PIP. So I would like to highlight especially the questions and answers section of the website, which this is the main menu, but also each of these sections have a sub-menu with more questions, so it's quite broad. And I find it particularly useful because it contains very practical advice, such as how, when, and in which format you need to submit a PAP, and also information on when to expect feedback from the PDCO, for instance. So very practical, very useful. Here, there are some ways you can interact with the pediatric office. Of course, you can contact the assigned pediatric coordinator for your procedure, or also you can contact us in this email address, pediatrics@ema.europa.eu. You can also request pre-submission meetings, as mentioned before, in other areas as well, to ensure a smooth validation when the PAP is already ready for submission. So it's when it's already quite advanced, the preparation of the PAP, and it aims at regulatory and administrative questions in general. Companies can also request clarification of the PDCO request for modification. These are to clarify any details on the PDCO request for modification during clock stop. Later on, I will explain a little bit about the timelines and clock stops. And in this case, this meeting may involve scientific discussions with the rapporteur and peer reviewer. So here in this slide, it summarizes the structure of a PIP. You see that mainly there are three main parts. The first one, part 8, is where it contains the product and regulatory information. It's a PDF form. The second part, and most important one, is scientific part from B to E, which includes all this information listed here. This is a standalone document that includes all essential information on the pediatric development. Also in part E, it's a deferral request, which I will explain a bit further on the next slide. And there is also the key element form, which is a document that summarizes very concisely the quality, preclinical, and clinical studies proposed by the applicant that will be the basis of the opinion. The PAP should reflect a rounded picture of the product development in optimal detail, showing also the strategic view on the progress from non-clinical to adult data and to existing data for the development in children. It should also contain justification for all proposed studies or waiver sufficient for the PDCO to inform or to adopt an informed decision or opinion. Let's see what a deferral is. A deferral means that results of studies which are deferred do not have to be provided at the next regulatory submission. A deferral does not mean that the PAP application can be submitted late, but it means that the agreed studies or measures in the PAP can be initiated and or completed later in relation to the adult development. A deferral may be applicable to some or all studies contained in the PIP, and it also may apply to only completion of the studies or both initiation and completion of each of the studies contained in the PIP. And an example of when a deferral is granted is, for instance, when study results are deemed necessary prior to initiating studies in children, or when pediatric studies will take longer to conduct than studies in adults. Here I'd like to give some examples of common errors that we see in the submissions from a practical point of view. So, for instance, we see applicants that submit Form A, Part A, in using an old application form. So please always make sure that you use the forms and templates available on the website. A common problem as well encountered during the validation process of a PAP is uncompleted information, either in Part A or in Part B to E. Either can be scientific, lack of scientific justification for the studies, or can be any administrative information also. We also see requests for deferrals where studies are not proposed. So again, the deferral is for doing the studies, but not for proposing them. So even when requesting deferrals, the study should be there. And finally, just to remind you that hyperlinks are not allowed. As mentioned before, in this slide, I'd like to give you an overview of the procedures evaluated by the PDCO and its timelines. So for each of these procedures, a rapporteur, peer reviewer, and pediatric coordinator will be assigned. The first one is a PAP application, which is a 120-day procedure that accommodates a clock stop at day 60 when a request for modification is issued by the PDCO. A 120-day procedure means that the application will be discussed 4 times at the PDCO every 30 days, at day 30, 60, 90, and 120. Once the PAP has been submitted, as mentioned before, a PAP can be modified. So PAP modification is a 60-day procedure with no clock stop. At the end of it, PDCO opinion and subsequently a decision will be issued, and it's published on the MA website redacted. A PAP compliance check is also a 60-day procedure with no clock stop either, and it leads also to the issue of a PDCO opinion, but no decision. And finally, just for completeness, I have listed here 2 less common procedures that are 30-day procedures, which are confirmation of class waiver and inclusion of an indication with an agreed condition. As we've seen before, modification of the PAP may be necessary as the development progresses. This is the case when the measures contained in the PAP are no longer appropriate or unworkable. Some examples of this situation is when there is a change of formulation, or for instance, when the applicant is encountering recruitment difficulties, so the study population agreed with the PDCO is no longer feasible, and also when there is a need to extend the timelines. These are typical examples of situations where a modification is necessary. As regards compliance check, a compliance check is the verification that some of all studies agreed in a PAP have been conducted in accordance with the PAP decision. Compliance checks are necessary prior to marketing authorization application or modification of a marketing authorization. Compliance check can be either full when it's done against all measures, or can be partial when it's only done on the measures that are not deferred. It should be submitted at least 2 months prior to the planned submission of a regulatory application. And applicants may request the PDCO to confer compliance in advance of the regulatory applications, or alternatively, compliance will be checked as part of the variation procedure of a marketing authorization application or other procedures. But we strongly recommend to come earlier, not to wait until the marketing authorization application in order to ensure a smooth compliance check. Here in this slide, there are some of the incentives given to applicants as per the pediatric legislation. We see that the reward is given to completed PAPs if the development is compliant with the agreed PAP, obviously, if results of studies, either positive or negative, are included in the summary of product characteristics, and if the product is authorized also in all member states except for Pumas. For non-orphan products, the reward is a 6-month extension of the supplementary protection certificate. For orphan products, as my colleague Matthias has mentioned, it's a 2 years of extension of marketing exclusivity. And for Pumas, is 10 years of data and market protection. Of note, product-specific or class waivers does not trigger the reward, and inconclusive studies in PAPs do not trigger the reward either. the results should be either positive or negative, but not unconclusive. When we reach here, the part on achievements of the Paediatric Regulation, as you may be aware, the 10-year report on the implementation of the Paediatric Regulation has been recently published, and it shows a positive impact on pediatric drug development. For instance, more medicines in children have been authorized. Here you have some figures. And also better and more information for prescribers and patients have been done. More than 140 updates of the product information, for instance. It has also led to better pediatric research and development, more regulatory support for pediatric matters, and pediatrics now being an integral part of the medicine development. Here you have the link if you want to go through the report. The 10-year report shows also an increase in medicines for children in many therapeutic areas in the last 10 years, most notably in the areas of rheumatology, where before 2007, very limited therapeutic options were available. And since then, 14 completed PAPs have been done and 8 pediatric new indications been granted. Also in the cardiovascular areas, we have now several antihypertensives and cholesterol-lowering agents. For infectious disease, we have new treatments for hepatitis C, HIV infection, fungal infections, and new antibiotics. And for oncology, we have the first treatment for pediatric neuroblastoma, and also new, less toxic regimes. Yes, some of the indications approved were in areas where there were no approved pediatric medicines before, or in age groups where there were not treatments approved before. This slide is to highlight the importance of bringing stakeholders together to continue improving medicines for children. This is important to ensure that pediatric medicines are covered, pediatric needs, are covered when rapid development in innovation is happening, and to streamline the study designs and to establish priorities in future research. For this reason, EMA aims to act as a platform for facilitating stakeholders' interaction and constructive dialogue through stakeholders' workshops. Here you have some examples, images of workshops that have been held before. And to finalize, some take-home messages here. Also think pediatric in advance. Bear in mind that pediatric needs and requirements in most drug developments from the start, that PAP waiver request needs to be prepared during or before phase 1 studies in adults or equivalent. Consider time also needed to prepare the final study report when calculating compliance check, and also marketing authorization application deadlines. Remember that pediatric regulation applies also to national products, not only to centralized ones. And also please make sure of all opportunities for interaction. So contact your pediatric coordinator or send us an email to the pediatric offices when needed. Also, my colleagues in the other offices, scientific advice and orphans, we are here willing to help. That's it.